Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, 6 Cutting-Edge HR Metrics to Measure in 2019. I'm really excited to have this. So my name is JC, and I'm a Senior Content Marketing Manager at PayScale. I'll be your host today. Before we get started, just a couple of things for you guys to know. First of all, this webinar is being recorded. You will all receive the recording and the slides within 1 or 2 business days. Second, this webinar is approved by both SHRM and HRCI for recertification credit. At the very end of the webinar, we will release those redemption codes to you so you can claim your credit. We will also be emailing you the codes as well, so look out for that. And then let's see. So during the webinar, if you have questions that come up, please feel free to type them into the console. I'm monitoring the questions, so I'll try to answer the ones I can, but we do have some time reserved at the end for Q&A with our speakers today. With that, I'm excited to introduce the agenda and the speakers. So the agenda today, we will kind of first start off with a framework of what people analytics means and how your organization could evolve your people analytics maturity. Then we'll really talk about the entire talent life cycle in 3 different stages. We'll talk about the key metrics you need to know in order to improve how you find talent, develop talent, and retain your talent. We'll also talk about a few key compensation metrics which are good for you to be able to diagnose issues that could affect all these different stages of your talent life cycle. And finally, we'll have some time for Q&A with our speakers. Okay, I'd like to introduce you our speakers. We have 2 awesome speakers today. First one is Eric Knudsen from Namely, and then we have Rita Patterson from PayScale. So Eric is the manager of people analytics at Namely, an all-in-one HR software platform for mid-sized companies. To Namely, he contributed to data and analytics works in industries like higher education, aviation, and now technology. Eric's current work focuses on leveraging people data spanning the full employee life cycle to help Namely clients build better workplaces. Then we have Rita. Rita Patterson is the senior manager of PayScale's product implementation team. Rita has been here for 5 years. After spending 5 years in recruiting, Rita came across PayScale and was struck by the breadth of information PayScale could provide regarding market data and compensation best practices. She jumped at the chance to work at PayScale, and she's been happily working with our customer success teams for the past 5 years. Welcome, Eric and Rita. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I'll jump right in. Hi, everyone. I'm Eric. I'm going to be leading you through the first segment of our chat today. And I thought it'd be helpful to lead off with the people analytics maturity model. Many of you may have seen versions of this model that started with Burson by Deloitte. They've also released specifically a talent analytics maturity model, but they generally mirror each other in many ways. And I think this model helps set sort of the tone for conversations about data. So I'll go through this model pretty quickly. Basically, the idea is when HR teams are just beginning to develop, they start at level 1, this reactive and compliance-driven level. And at this stage in the maturity of HR, teams are purely responding to events happening around them. So they're not quite sure how to get ahead of things that are happening in the organization. And they're just simply observing what's going on and then making decisions after things have happened about how to handle those scenarios. When a team graduates to level 2, they become a little more proactive. So at this stage, they're beginning to see more patterns in the organization and identify what is important to that company. And this is an important stage because it's the point at which HR teams are beginning to identify the kinds of trends they want to monitor and understand better. When through level 2 onto level 3, they become more strategic and aligned with the organization. And so at this point, they begin to take data, metrics, and transform those into analytics, which really tie data to decision making. So before level 3, teams are not doing very much to bring data into conversations about actual talent decisions that are being made internally. But at level 3, this is starting to happen. Still, though, the company sees HR as sort of its own organization, and it's not yet well integrated with the business. That occurs at level 4, in which finally HR has been able to link talent events, talent metrics, and talent data to critical business outcomes. So now we're tying talent initiatives to business metrics like revenue, for example. And this is a stage at which HR is considered not just a cost or a liability, but beginning to present itself or position itself as an asset. So most of the maturity models end at level 4. At Namely, we also like to think about level 5 and 6 internally, where as an HR software product, we never really stopped thinking about the impact that our HR or our approach to HR can impact the broader HR discipline through the products and services that we're offering mid-sized companies. And so we have level 5 there, where we think about that. And finally, our maturity model culminates in level 6, which is sort of thinking about the role of Namely in the broader ecosystem of HR technologies. So whereas level 5 is about impacting the discipline through our product, level 6 is about impacting the HR discipline more broadly through partnerships with other organizations that share our mission to improve HR. So today's presentation, one of our goals is to help get a lot of you from where you probably are, which is somewhere between level 2 and level 3, to bump you a little more towards that level 3. So we're going to equip you with data and metrics that will hopefully help you think about tying your talent to actual decisions and actions internally. I wanted to point out a couple of major obstacles to moving from level 2 to level 3. First is data hygiene and a lack of process for keeping data clean and complete. It's very common that at level 2, an organization still has very messy talent data, and it hasn't quite figured out how to keep that clean and how to, number one, clean up the data they have, and then how to actually keep new and incoming data clean. And so the first way to tackle that is to define individual ownership over various data points that fuel the talent strategy, and then automate where possible so that you don't have, or you reduce the amount of manual input that can cause error and problems in your data. Another obstacle is when there's little or no consistency in the definitions of your talent metrics. So if you're calculating turnover rate, is the average headcount you use in that formula the headcount at the start of the year, the end of the year? Is it the end? Is it the average of the month, start and end? Defining these formulas is critical to being consistent in how you're tying data to your business. And then a third major obstacle is simply HR early on often doesn't have that much support, resourcing, and enablement by the broader organization. And you can help sort of elevate your presence in the organization by sharing a little bit more widely, openly, and frequently about the things you're doing internally to build out your talent strategy. Often employees and even leaders don't understand the amount of work that goes into building a talent strategy, and so we should be sharing very widely and very frequently. So just a few obstacles from getting level 2 to level 3. And yeah, so that's the model that'll help guide our thinking over the next 40, 50 minutes or so, as we talk through some of the metrics you might consider measuring. So what is people analytics? So I mentioned a little earlier these words data, metrics, and analytics, and we often confuse these three terms. They're often mistakenly used interchangeably, but they're actually different things. So data are individual points or individual bits of information. So an example of a data point might be someone's departure date or termination date. We combine a series or a collection, a group of data points into what we call metrics. So metrics are combinations of data points. For example, turnover rate, where we might take that departure date. We might take departure dates across our company, average headcount, and then combine those two to develop our turnover rate metric. But even metrics aren't quite analytic. So that final step to analytics is when you take the data and the metrics you've produced and you start tying them to the talent decisions you're making internally. So in order to produce true analytics, you need to actually be using data to inform decision-making and process across the talent lifecycle so that you can make with a little bit more strategy behind them. Cool. So with that in mind, here are the three major phases of the employee lifecycle. So we talk about using data across the lifecycle. The reality is there are, even more phases than this, from recruiting to onboarding, training, learning and development, performance, engagement. Realistically, there are many more phases. But in order to not keep you here for 2 hours, we figured we would bucket them into three higher level phases. Finding talent, which is traditionally what we think of as attracting and recruiting the right people into our organization. Accelerating talent, which is the phase at which we've now brought the right people, or what we hope are the right people, into the organization, and we can grow and develop them to help elevate our company. And then retaining, the retaining talent phase, which is focused on basically keeping the talent that we've now found and grown internally, making sure we know who the right people are and that they're sticking around. And then we would be remiss not to talk about one of the most critical elements of a broader talent strategy, which is compensation and ensuring equity in pay across all phases of the life cycle. So at all points during an employee's time with us and their experience with us, we need to be making sure that we're creating a fair workplace experience, especially in regards to compensation and pay equity. And so Rita will touch on that. So let's jump in. So the first phase is finding talent. This is that recruiting phase. We talk a lot in the people analytics space about the opportunities we have in recruiting. And that's because there's so much opportunity here to work with data. We actually, generally the greatest volume of data we have in HR is on the recruiting front, because we're touching so many different people, including people that end up never joining the organization. And so it's really important to get our hiring data strategy in the right place. Having good hiring data allows us to identify the right people to bring into the organization. It helps us understand how well we're doing at finding those right people and ensure that the process we're using to find those people is fair and objective. And so the process is not adversely impacting any group of candidates. It also allows us to facilitate a greater understanding across the organization about where we're finding the best and most diverse talent. All of this is important because effective, objective, standardized hiring practices are more likely to yield high-performing and diverse workforces. I mean, we have the discipline has produced a wealth of research that has demonstrated that companies with more diverse workforces and leadership teams tend to outperform their non-diverse peers. And so it's critical that we're thinking about this as we're building out our hiring data strategy. There's another interesting point, which is that we've recently seen an explosion of recruiting technology that's grounded in machine learning that augments or crowdsources data across a lot of companies to yield improved hiring outcomes. There are many benefits to this, including companies without enough data can sort of leverage the wisdom of the masses to try and optimize their hiring decisions. Then there are also some cons where if you've been reading in the field, there are also some challenges where the field is building algorithms that are basically baking our own human biases into these sort of systematic tools that we're using. So there are some challenges there as well. That's outside the scope of our chat today, but anything you can do on your front to be aware of these pros and cons as you build out your hiring strategy is sort of critical to making sure we're making the best decision for our organizations. So, key metric for this phase is quality of hire. We talk a lot about quality of hire and the challenges of defining it. And there continue to be challenges with this, which we'll talk about shortly. But we chose this metric because every organization should be collecting or measuring some sort of reflective metric on their hiring decisions. So how do we build a quality of hire metric? Well, first we have to figure out what we value as a company. This is actually the trickiest part. Internally at Namely, when we were building out our quality of hire framework, we sat down with a variety of well-respected leaders in the company and sat down with the rest of the people team and had pretty candid conversations about the elements of someone's contribution here at the company that we value the most and that we want to make sure we're doing a good job bringing into the organization. So these will vary by company. And so just as an example, Namely looked at performance, the fit between the candidate and the requirements of their job, their level of productivity or their ramp early on, and the level of fit between their values and the values of the company. These were the 4 components that we considered most important to us. These may or may not look like the components that you choose for your company. And that's why it's important to have candid conversations with your teams and leaders internally to figure out what you value the most. Once you've identified what's important, you need to build process for collecting data for each one. So in some cases, this may be objective. Perhaps you have early formal performance reviews. So you may have some sort of quantitative metric that's already on the books pretty early on. Or maybe if you're talking about salespeople, productivity in terms of sales productivity might be a pretty objective metric. In other cases, especially for mid-sized companies, it's a little trickier to find objective metrics. And often the best substitute approach is to administer a survey, much like an early performance review in some sense, but focused more on covering all of the quality of hire components that you've decided are valuable. So I'll show you an example of that shortly. And the important thing here is that you're measuring quality of hire at the individual level. And then when you're reporting it, you're combining into some organizational level metric. And the reason for this is if you just compute your quality of hire metric at the company level, you can't slice and dice that metric across different segments of the organization in order to action that better or improve your hiring practices in certain parts of the company, and not invest so much in others. So measuring at the individual level allows you to slice and dice however you want, and then combining up to the organizational level for reporting to your board of directors or your exec team is generally best practice. So here's a sample survey you might send out if you lack objective data to include in this metric. This sample survey would generally go to a manager of a new hire somewhere between probably 2 and 3 months after someone starts at the company. And if you just review these questions, you'll see that there's one per component. You can expand this or shrink it, but generally we would recommend that you have distinct measurements or items for each component so that you can also not just calculate the average of these scores and call that quality of hire, but you can actually see across your candidates to what extent are we hiring people who are aligned with our company values. So now you're pulling out just 1 or 2 pieces of that metric. Again, this is in line with the strategy to be able to slice and dice as you see fit. So hopefully this sample survey is helpful for getting the gears spinning in terms of what you might implement in your company. In terms of actually taking this and following through to action. So as I said, you might say you went with a survey strategy. You would send out a quality of hire survey to managers of your new hires who have hit their, say, around their 2 or 3 month mark. Some organizations do, a 90-day survey. This would be pretty well aligned with that. So if you sent out a new hire 90-day survey, you might consider sending out a quality of hire survey to the manager at the same time for convenience. The next step would be so once you've collected that data, you might you will open your data, you'll average your scores together. So you'll actually have your quality of hire metric at the individual level. And then you can roll those up into an organizational level metric. So you can do this a couple ways. One is you might average all your individual scores together, and that's your company level score. Another way that we actually chose to do it internally at Namely was to report a percentage of the individuals that were above threshold. So we chose, say, on a 5-point scale, the percentage of individuals who were above 4.0. And that way we could actually see across everyone about what percent of new hires are above our sort of quality of hire standard. And then the last step would be, of course, to track and monitor this over time. One data point for 1 month or 1 quarter or 1 year is not enough to tell you anything about your strategy. What is important is to monitor your quality of hire metric over time and gain insight into whether that metric is increasing, decreasing, or stagnating. And that helps you make decisions about how effectively you're hiring and when and how you can improve. All right, jumping into the next phase, accelerating talent. So this is once we've found the right people and brought them in, we want to be thinking about how we're measuring the opportunities we're creating for people. We want to do this because it helps supplement our workforce planning efforts. It helps us understand the changing shape of our organization, and I'll explain that in a moment. And then it also helps us facilitate more tailored employee career growth and opportunities internally. So if we're not using data to reflect on these processes, internally, then we don't necessarily have the information we need to help grow our employees effectively. And so the metric we'll talk about here is career path ratio. So career path ratio is basically a metric of movement in your organization. So I'll draw your attention to the diagram on the bottom. Many organizations are structured in a pyramid shape. I'll talk about flat organizations in a moment, but we'll start with pyramid. So a lot of companies have different job levels, and people are either promoted into new job levels, or they might make lateral moves into new roles at the same level. And monitoring this movement is important because if you imagine that a number of people on the bottom of this pyramid get promoted to higher levels, say individual contributors become managers and directors, what happens is that pyramid becomes quite top heavy. Even if you replace each of those people promoted with one person, you're still becoming top heavy, because generally you want to be bringing in more people at lower levels as you move others up in the organization. Top heavy organizations are problematic because at some point you've now created a company wherein people on the bottom no longer have opportunities to move up because so many people have already sort of been bumped up and they've taken all of the spots for manager, director, VP roles in the company. And so we want to know at what rate people are moving up versus sideways in the organization. In order to do that, number one, you need clear job levels. So you need your job tiers defined so you know what constitutes a true promotion versus a lateral move. And then you need to plug numbers into this formula for career path ratio. So it's a pretty simple formula. It's just basically the number of moves considered promotions over the number of promotions plus the number of other moves or lateral moves. And the higher that number is, the more upward movement there is in the organization. SHRM's benchmark for career path ratio in 2017 was 0.7, just for reference. That was across all organizations. Cool. So in terms of flat organizations, you can use an adapted form of this metric. Even in flat organizations, there's some notion of growth internally, hopefully. And generally the idea would be to, hopefully you're measuring whatever that version, that flat version of growth is. You would sub that in for what here we call promotions. And there may be another version of lateral moves, which there may be lateral moves too, but if there are not, there may be ways of measuring the opportunities you're presenting for people to expand their skill set. And that would be akin to a lateral move. So they're not necessarily sort of moving up in the company or even expanding their responsibility, but rather they're just expanding their skill set or trying something new. Pretty simple to follow through on a career path ratio strategy here. First, you export your job title history so you know what moves people have made internally, what roles they've moved between. You're going to use that job tiering structure, or in flat organizations, that growth framework that I just mentioned, to classify what becomes promotions or the numerator of your ratio and what constitutes a lateral move. And then you want to monitor this metric over time. So like I said, the SHRM benchmark is 0.7 or 0.7. You can use that as sort of an anchor, and just to know if you're moving more people up in the organization than your average company, or moving more people laterally than your average company. The final stage is retaining talent. So we've found the right people, we've brought them in, now we want to make sure that they don't go anywhere and continue to contribute to the wonderful workplace that we're building. It's important to get your retention data right because, number one, it helps us target and engage the right people in our company. Again, this helps us inform our workforce planning efforts. And the third bullet here is an interesting point, and it highlights the fact that in HR, we often talk about turnover and attrition. In other words, we focus a lot of our energy on those that are leaving the company, and sometimes we forget about those who are staying. Another hurdle for the discipline to good retention data is that retention and turnover are often confused as opposites of one another. So in other words, if turnover is 30%, you think retention is 70%, but that's actually not the way that we calculate retention. And you'll see how we calculate retention in a moment when we talk about top performer retention rate. So top performer retention rate is basically a percentage of top performers who were here at the beginning of the month or quarter or year, who are still here at the end of that month, quarter, or year. And so to get there, we first need to define what it means to be a top performer. Maybe you have a structured performance rating scale, so you know very clearly what that means. You may not have such a structured performance scale, in which case the first step would be to begin exploring and defining the people that make some of the most valuable contributions to the company. In other words, who are the people that you don't want to lose? Next, you want to establish some sort of standards for what your retention targets are. This may vary by department across the company based on, if you tend to lose more employees in one organization, you might focus targets more heavily on that part of your company than other parts. And then you want to equip managers with the information they need to make sure they're optimizing for retention. So you should be pulling managers into conversations about retention, and you should help them feel ownership over creating the kind of experience for their teams that keeps top performers at the company. So just a quick summary or a quick rundown of the formula. You basically look at the number of top performers. Let's start on the bottom. The number of top performers at the start of the period, say 2018. So how many top performers did we have on January 1st, 2018? Over that, the numerator, we put the number of top performers, number of those people, the same people who were still here on December 31st, 2018. We'll get a fraction there, say 0.85. And then to get a percentage, we just multiply that by 100. We end up with, say, in that example, 85% top performer retention. So I explained most of this already, but basically you want to be including your start and termination date fields and any segments of interest that you might want to cut retention by in your data source. When you calculate retention, you want to do it company-wide. So what is our overall company retention? Then you want to filter down to just top performers and recalculate your retention. You always want to make sure your top performer retention is above your broader company retention. And then if retention begins to drop among top performers, because you're monitoring it, hopefully you can begin to get ahead of an accelerating decline in the retention of those people who are contributing the most value to your company. So when you start to see that dip, start talking to people, managers, employees, find out what's going on quickly and begin to act fast, but in a way that is meaningful and shows that you intend to improve the situation for those that are having the greatest impact. So those are metrics you'd measure across 3 phases of the employee lifecycle. And as I mentioned earlier, across all of these phases, you also need to be thinking about the way that you're structuring compensation for your employees and the extent to which you're creating a fair and equitable workplace. So I'm going to pass it off to Rita to talk us through some of that.
All right, thanks so much, Eric. That was really interesting. The piece about career path ratio and top performer retention were really interesting to me. I made some notes about that for myself as well. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in for about 20 minutes and talk about compensation metrics and leave us some time at the end for Q&A. What I'm really going to be focused on today is a couple of key things, four key compensation metrics: pay compression, market underpayment, flight risks, and pay disparity. We're going to dig into what each of these things really means, or where we're coming from, our definition from the pay scale perspective. And then we're going to talk about how they align with each other, as well as sort of the best possible ways to measure them and why you would or would not be measuring these things. So first and foremost, let's talk about pay compression. Pay compression really specifically is when you've got two different levels of a same or similar jobs where the pay difference is kind of really inconsequential. And some of the best examples I've seen of this are in hourly positions like machinery work, warehouse work, where you've got a warehouse clerk and a warehouse supervisor with a very, very minimal difference in pay. And needless to say, that starts to breed a lot of feeling of inequity or unfairness, especially for supervisors. And the most common reasoning for that is that a supervisor may have been there a while and their pay has been moving at a fairly moderate rate. Even when they were promoted, maybe it was a fairly moderate increase, but the market value of the individual, warehouse clerk role has been moving pretty significantly and moving at a faster rate. So in this example, you might have that warehouse supervisor making $23 an hour. And 2 years ago, when they were promoted, the warehouse clerks were making $20 an hour. But now those warehouse clerks are making $22 an hour, and the wage for that supervisor has not moved at the same rate. And we know that we're all at really high risk of this type of scenario, because often the market is moving faster than we're able to keep track of for certain jobs, sometimes surprising jobs. And also because there is often a heavier emphasis on funding new hires than there is on funding promotions and increases and moving people through their pay ranges. And so really there's a couple ways to avoid this pay compression. One is to monitor the market movement. And monitoring the market movement does not mean always doing something about it right then and there. But the way to get ahead of these types of scenarios is to just be taking a pulse as often as possible at the rate with which the market for certain positions is moving. A really good time to do that is prior to budgeting for things like increase season. And similarly, what's really important is to constantly be reviewing internal pay ranges and ensuring that not only is the overlap relevant for pay from like an individual contributor to their supervisor, but also that the difference in the sort of like promotional increase is relevant and not super closely correlated to the existing pay. So again, this example I gave was, at the time when this person was promoted, it was $23 versus $20. They got a $3 increase per hour. But by the time the market kept moving, the people that were reporting to them, it was only $1 per hour difference. So those are the types of things to really look at for pay compression. And the easiest way to do that is just kind of, an average pay per employee comparison to their supervisor or manager. Especially with larger groups of employees, you can look at that pretty easily. So we're going to talk a little bit about some other ways that we might unintentionally run into sort of payment that is a little bit off skew. With market underpayment, what we're really talking about is people who are paid below a desired target within the market of a relevant market. The term market underpayment is something that we hear from a lot of people pretty often. A lot of people in the universe sort of go, yeah, I'm paid low in the market. One of the really, really important things to assessing the reality of market underpayment is to define your market and define where you're actually targeting to pay in that market. So defining the market involves defining your competitive set. What is the actual collection of locations, industries, and organizational types and sizes that you're wanting to compare to? So we say competitive set, but you can also think about it as comparative set. Not all markets are created equal. Someone who is working at a small software startup in Southern California, their market is not Amazon or Google. So it would be easy for them to look at that market and feel like they're underpaid. But when we actually want to look at something like the metrics and analysis around underpayment to the market, we really need to define that market appropriately. And then also we want to make sure that we're benchmarking jobs to the most similar roles in the market to identify a going rate for a position. Needless to say, we've got tools at PayScale that help with things like that. But most importantly, what we really like to encourage people to do is take a little bit of time to poke around and make sure that the market benchmark for a job is the best available benchmark in that particular market as it's been defined. The other two pieces here are ensuring that the internal pay ranges that are created by your organization are heavily based on that market rate, but also have a notion toward the internal value of a role. Often we'll see positions that have a little bit of variance in the market, but they might be sort of equals in your organization. A great example of that is a lot of organizations have like manager roles where they like to try and keep all the manager roles within similar ranges or similar grades if you have grade-based ranges. And so that's an important relevance here is you might have something that looks like market underpayment, but it's a choice to have a range for that role internally that leans more heavily on the internal value. And of course, we want to align pay for all employees in a same or similar job within that market-based pay range, and we'll talk a little bit more about pay equity and how that all applies there. So let's switch gears just a little bit and talk about what we call flight risks. And so we talked about pay range. A pay range is the notion of taking the market data and building an internal pay range around both that market data and the internal value of a role. And a flight risk is really someone who's not only low in range, AKA below the midpoint of their range, but they're also in the high performer category. Now, Eric talked a lot about performance and sort of retaining high performers. I thought that that was a really interesting point that, you know, we don't just measure retention. We should really be thinking about retention of our top performers, and flight risks really goes hand in hand with that. The very first thing you want to look at if you have any sense that your top performers are leaving in droves or disgruntled or really sort of you're at risk, you want to look at, do we have people that are performing really well but are pretty low in their pay range?
So we're talking about measuring position and range, and there's a couple different ways to do that. Comp ratio and range penetration are two primary ways to handle measuring position and range. So I'm going to jump right in and talk specifically about each of those. So comp ratio is really looked at as a fraction or a sort of ratio point. Comp ratio is really often used by organizations who have a more standard comp history, and the finance or comp teams really look at comp ratio for the entire organization. And so the measurement of that comp ratio is really looking at the employee's current salary over the midpoint of that internal pay range. If you use comp ratio today, probably you're looking at it from a pretty broad spectrum. And often, for example, we're seeing organizations look at comp ratio by job family or across the entire organization. And so that would really be the primary reason to measure comp ratio would be if you're looking at things from a pretty high level perspective and you want to use comp ratio as a metric for paying within your pay range. It's a really helpful analysis if your primary goal is to keep people's pay pretty closely aligned with the minimum of their pay range. This is especially helpful for organizations that have a pretty standard existing set of employees and jobs. It tends to be a little bit less useful for organizations that are growing quickly because the rate of movement through positions, through career paths, and through ranges is going to be pretty fast. And so steady comp ratio might not be the metric that matters to you. Range penetration tends to be a little bit more useful for organizations who are leaning heavily on managers and employees to understand their pay together. If you're leaning heavily on managers to communicate pay, and you're not as focused on someone being at the clean midpoint of their pay, but you are focused on people moving through their range, or more importantly, focused on communicating where they are at in their range. Range penetration tends to be more useful for those types of scenarios, and measuring range penetration can tell you a little bit more about how things like career path, career progression, range progression, and especially performance are aligning, and how you're actually sort of putting your money where your mouth is. If you're really telling people that you're going to be moving pay as they increase performance, which we talked about, pay disparity being sort of running into that situation sometimes, you want to be looking at something like range penetration. So I'm going to keep us moving here. We talked about comp ratio and range penetration, and I do want to talk about pay equity. And specifically, pay equity is important right now. That's not lost on anybody in this session. You see the news, you know what's going on. And the important thing about pay equity is it didn't just come up. It's always been something that's been important. But like many other things, when we have a big culture shift, is it got visibility. So we're in a point right now in this culture shift where pay equity has massive visibility. And so it's providing us a lot of opportunity to make it a priority. It's something that can sort of not matter until it matters, but because of where we're at in this culture shift, we have the opportunity to take advantage of this priority. And one of the first things to think about when we look at pay equity is pay disparity. And that is any time two people in the same job or very similar jobs have a large variance in pay, right? This is the umbrella, is pay disparity. There's a ton of different things we need to look at when we notice that pay disparity is happening. But really, when it comes to pay disparity, we want to ask ourselves a few things. Number one, is the variance for pay reasonable? Is there a standard with which we are awarding pay increases to a particular job based on something like tenure, performance, or other factors tied to measurable differences in how someone is showing up in a job? The other question we want to ask is, are these employees really in the same job? Have we gotten into a situation where we need to carve this job out into levels? Is there someone whose title is project manager, but they've really turned into a program manager, and we actually need to re-benchmark that job? Often we'll find that when there is pay disparity, it's because there's been an unspoken notion that someone has changed jobs, someone has become more senior, someone has been rewarded for their performance, and we haven't really documented that or acknowledged it. What we also find in terms of pay disparity is we want to address these things, because if none of these things are true, then we might have some systemic bias. We might have some unintended inequity that is coming from a place where we need to start investigating gender equity in some of those types of things. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So when it comes to pay equity and pay disparity, we know we want to first identify gaps in pay. We want to assess these potential differences. And then by all means, one of the huge activities that's going to be important here is reviewing that gender gap. And so we'll dig in at a high level real quick and then dig in a little bit more detailed. The gender equity report, here's an example of one that we use at PayScale. It's helpful at a high level. This type of information really tells you, is there a systemic issue that's running through your entire organization about gender pay? But where it becomes even more useful is at a job level. And the reason this is because we know in our research at PayScale that a lot of organizations do not have issues with pay equity per job, across the organization. I'm going to reverse that. They might have an issue across the organization, but when they start digging in per job, like in this example, men and women are paid fairly equally in this position. But we have potentially some systemic issues where the representation of certain parties, especially in this gender analysis, are not the same in certain jobs. You're going to end up with jobs that have a significant portion of women versus men. We know from a lot of our data that a lot of the notion of gender equity in a lot of organizations is because there's actually opportunity inequity. So this type of thing is really important to drill down per job because it helps you assess where your biggest gaps are versus just looking at the big picture and not really knowing where to start. So I know we're getting to the top of the hour, so I'm going to move us through. Communicating pay is an important thing. I would love to talk more with you about it. We've got a lot of webinars on communicating pay that you can come talk to us about as well. But I want to kick us to really the end of our session here and end with Eric talking about what our takeaways are. So Eric, do you mind telling us a little bit about some of the takeaways from all of the things we talked about today? All right, we might still be having some sound issues here. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up here today. I apologize that we didn't get to more of our questions and for our sound issues. But hopefully you'll be hearing more from, or you can come hear more from us at Namely and PayScale. Both of our organizations have the opportunity to provide webinars and think pieces. So you can definitely come check out our websites to hear more about that. And you all will be receiving a recording of this session. And also one of our last pieces here is that this session is applicable for SHRM and HRCI credits. So you see those in front of you and those will also get emailed out to you as well.
Right.
Thanks everyone.